You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that will make you wonder how many monsters you may have encountered in your life without even knowing it. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Stumble, and it's about a series of pictures that lead police down a rabbit hole. The second story you'll hear is called Psychopath, and it's about an evil person who makes a horrifying decision. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Pier, and it's about a couple who stumbles upon their worst nightmare on a beach. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to install brand new hardwood floors in the Follow Button's house, but on installation day, remove all their old flooring, but then just quit the job and leave. Okay, let's get into our first story.
In 1987, 21-year-old Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband, and she was living with her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful, but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory, and so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur, and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over, she was so tired. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last 2 pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna. Because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life.
Our next story is called Psychopath.
In 2008, 28-year-old Chris Smith was an up-and-coming star in the lead generation business. Lead generation is not a flashy business. Basically, you create these ads that are designed to generically help people with things like lowering their mortgage payments or reducing their credit card debt. And in these ads, you leave behind a 1-800 number for anybody interested to call. And the people that do call, their information is taken down, and then the lead generator, the person who made that ad, they sell that information to mortgage brokers and debt consolidators and anybody else that wants access to that lead. Chris's ability to create these really compelling ads and get people to call said number was so good that it caught the attention of another up-and-comer in the lead generation space, a man by the name of Ed Shin. Ed worked for a lead generation company called LG Tech in Southern California, and Ed wound up hiring Chris to come onto their team as a consultant. Right away, Chris and Ed totally hit it off, despite being very different people. Chris was a surfer bro who wore flip-flops and t-shirts every day and never went to college. Ed was a very sharply dressed, college-educated father of 3 who went to church every Sunday. But where they overlapped was their shared desire to become fabulously wealthy. After working together for a little while at LG Tech and doing quite well for themselves, they realized they could actually make a lot more money if they left LG Tech and formed their own lead generation business. And so in early 2009, they did just that. They left LG Tech and they formed a new company called 800 Exchange. And right away, it took off, generating millions and millions of dollars in revenue, 80% of which was profit. During this incredible time, Chris used some of his money to buy a brand new Range Rover and a beautiful condo in Laguna Beach, and he fell in love with this beautiful ballet dancer named Erica. By and large, Chris seemed to be putting his roots down and really building a life for himself. As for Ed, despite his squeaky clean outward appearance as being this all-star family man and father, he was using his cash to party and gamble in Las Vegas. When Ed was at LG Tech, he would regularly go to Las Vegas to generate business, and while he was there, he developed a gambling addiction. When he and Chris formed 800 Exchange, Ed continued to go to Las Vegas to drum up business. It was something he was good at. But when he and Chris started making money hand over fist, his gambling addiction grew tenfold and he went completely off the rails. Ed was spending so much money in Las Vegas, sometimes up to 6 figures an hour, that one of the main casinos there would fly him in their private jet out to Las Vegas and they would put him in their very best suite, fully comped. It's unclear how aware Chris was of Ed's crazy spending habits because Chris rarely went to Las Vegas with Ed. The men were living their respective dreams until October of that year when Ed was charged with embezzlement. Their former employer, LG Tech, had alleged that Ed had siphoned off about $2.5 million from their business to fund his wild Las Vegas lifestyle. Ed told Chris these allegations were totally false, but Chris was shaken. He was worried that if he didn't do something about this, Ed could potentially embezzle money from 800 Exchange. And so Chris went out and got a lawyer to begin protecting himself from his business partner. Over the following few months, Ed and Chris attempted to run 800 Exchange before Ed's trial date, but it was just too difficult because the trust had been totally destroyed by these allegations. And in May of 2010, Ed was convicted of felony embezzlement. In order to avoid jail time, Ed had taken a deal that meant he would need to pay roughly $800,000 of restitution to LG Tech. But Ed did not have $800,000. The only way he could make this payment would be if 800 Exchange, the business, fronted the money. But in order to do that, he would need Chris to sign off that he was okay with that because he owned half of the business. When Ed approached Chris, Chris said, "No, I'm not signing that. I'm worried you're going to take advantage of me too." But after a couple of weeks of talking to his lawyer, Chris finally told Ed that he was ready to meet up with him and come to some sort of agreement. And so on June 4th, the two men met up at the 800 Exchange office, and Chris decided to just sell his portion of the business to Ed for about $1 million, and then Ed can do whatever he needs to do with the business account to pay down his debts. Despite how crazy this situation was, Chris actually felt like this was kind of a win for him. He got a $1 million payday, and now he wanted to go out and celebrate. And so a couple of days after this meeting with Ed, Chris emails his family and says he's going to go on a 3-week vacation to South America and just go surfing the whole time. He's chartered this 45-foot yacht. He's hired a captain. He's hired a cook. It's going to be this dream vacation. He also regretted to inform them that he had broken it off with his girlfriend Erica, but he had a new girlfriend who'd be coming with him on this vacation, and she was a former Playboy playmate named Tiffany. His family was really surprised to hear the news about Erica because they really believed they were going to get married. But the trip itself was not really out of character. Chris had always said for the longest time that once he made it big and had millions of dollars in cash, he would just sail off into the Pacific and go surfing and just be off the grid and live his life in peace. And now he finally had a chance to do that. And so his family said, have fun, stay safe, and we'll see you when you get back. But 3 weeks went by and Chris did not return to his condo. Instead, he emailed his family again and just told them he was having this great time, that this was the best trip he could have asked for, and that instead of coming home, he was just going to keep sailing around the world and enjoying this time that he is disconnected from society. And again, his family said, okay, have a good time, stay safe, and we'll see you when we see you. But over the following weeks and months that Chris extended this vacation, his emails took a dark turn. Chris started to act depressed and he alluded to taking drugs, and then at one point he talked about doing the unthinkable, referencing harming himself. His parents were very concerned and told him he should come back home, or at the very least they should arrange to meet up somewhere. But every time they said this, Chris would just suddenly change the tone of his email and seem really upbeat and cheerful and said, oh no, I'm actually just fine and I just need some time to myself. Finally, in December of 2010, so 6 months after Chris has gone on this vacation, he reaches out to his brother Paul and asks him if he'll come to Costa Rica the following February to go surfing with him. Paul was excited and said he would go, and he and the rest of his family breathed a collective sigh of relief that now one of their family members would get to see Chris and actually check in on him. Shortly after this email exchange, Chris told his family that he was headed off into the Congo to sell some gold coins to a trader who was prepared to buy them at a 30% markup, and Chris was really excited about it. After this, there were no more emails. The family was concerned that this gold buyer potentially had kidnapped or hurt Chris, but Chris was going long periods of time between his emails to family, and so they figured, you know what, Paul's trip to Costa Rica where he's going to meet up with Chris is coming right up, so let's hold off doing anything drastic until then. But when February of 2011 rolled around and it was time for Paul to fly out to Costa Rica to meet up with Chris, before Paul left, he called the hotel in Costa Rica to confirm the reservations Chris had supposedly made. And the hotel said, we've never heard of Chris Smith. There are no reservations under his name. And so Paul tried to contact Chris, but to no avail. And so Paul told his family about it, and they decided it was best for Paul not to go to Costa Rica because probably Chris wasn't there. And the family instead got in touch with the State Department and asked them if they could help them find their son, their brother. And right away, the State Department discovered Chris's passport had never left the United States. And his family said that was impossible because for the past year, Chris has been sailing around the world. But the State Department said, this is what we got. So Chris's dad, who used to be a cop, drove out to California to speak to Ed, who was the last person to see Chris before he left on this vacation. And Ed would say he has no idea where Chris is. However, he did say Chris had a fake passport, and that might be why his passport was not showing up as leaving the country. Chris's father didn't really know what to make of this information, and so he decided it would be best to just file a missing person report and put the investigation in the hands of the police. Shortly after the report was filed, the police brought Ed in for questioning, and Ed reiterated that he didn't know where Chris was and that he did have this fake passport, and he also said that they had not ended on good terms. They were kind of fighting and bickering at the end, and that's why he hadn't heard from Chris since he left. Ed was cooperative and didn't really have much to give police, and so the police let him go. While the police hit dead end after dead end in this missing person case, the property manager of the office building where the 800 Exchange business had been located was growing increasingly frustrated. Shortly after Chris had sold his portion of the business to Ed and then gone on this vacation, Ed had moved 800 Exchange from that office building to another, and Ed had not paid his final rent, which was $40,000. And this property manager had repeatedly tried to get in touch with Ed, but Ed was totally blowing him off. One day, the property manager was griping about Ed and his delinquent payment to another tenant in the office building, a guy by the name of Joe DeLue, who just happened to be a private investigator. And during this discussion, the manager was saying that not only had Ed not made this payment, but he had also been recently questioned by police about his missing business partner who was still missing. And so Joe is immediately intrigued by this, and he says to the manager, it sounds like Ed is a pretty shady guy. Would it be possible for me to just poke my head around their old space now that it's vacant? Because you never know, there could be something in there. And so the manager said that was fine. He opened the door to the old 800 Exchange space. Joe walked inside and immediately found blood spatter on the door frame of where Chris's office used to be. He also found blood spatter on the ceiling and on the walls. And so Joe called the police, who showed up and sprayed luminol all over Chris's office, and there was blood everywhere. It would turn out Chris didn't sell his portion of the business to Ed. On that day, June 4th, 2010, Chris did go into the office to try to reach some agreement with Ed, but when he walked in, Ed promptly killed him with a knife or some other blunt object. Then he, or someone he hired, dumped Chris's body somewhere. After that, Ed stole all of Chris's money to pay off the debt to LG Tech, as well as some other large debts in Las Vegas. And then after that, Ed hijacked Chris's email accounts and pretended to be Chris for almost an entire year. Chris never took a boating trip around the world. He never broke up with Erica and had this new girlfriend from Playboy. He just got killed inside of his office, and Ed created this ridiculous, elaborate lie that was designed to make his family believe that Chris had become unstable and that maybe he did end his own life, or maybe he did get kidnapped or killed in the Congo. Ed was just trying to create that seed of doubt that he had anything to do with it. But in 2018, it all came crashing down for Ed when a jury convicted him of killing Chris and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Ed maintains his innocence, and to this day, Ed still will not give up where Chris's body is.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Pier.
At around 5:20 p.m. on August 31st, 2007, a young couple stepped onto the beautiful sand of Yelpo Beach, which is located at the very southern tip of South Korea. The couple grabbed each other's hands and smiled in excitement as they looked out on the water and saw all these fishing boats that dotted the horizon, and then behind them were all these beautiful mountains. I mean, this was a spectacular place. They couldn't believe that a place so gorgeous and so remote was located only a 1-hour train ride away from the busy city where they went to college. The couple's names were Kim and Chu. Kim was 21 years old, and he was an athlete and a very dedicated student. And Chu, she was 20 years old and also very studious, but maybe unlike Kim, she was a bit more reserved and shy. In fact, Kim was Chu's very first serious boyfriend, and she absolutely adored him. And in fact, this was going to be the couple's kind of big first trip that they would take together. It was a Friday, and Kim and Chu planned to spend the entire weekend exploring this place called Yelpo Beach. Yelpo Beach is located right against this quaint little fishing village, and it's famous for its beautiful silver-colored sand. In fact, the beach is so famous, lots of people come out here and just camp out on the beach because it's just so beautiful. There's also a very busy open-air seafood market right nearby, which is really cool because all the fishermen come in and literally offload their catch right onto the table, and they sell it to people coming by. And also, up in the mountains, you could see these beautiful bright green crops, which were tea plantations that made the air in Yelpo Beach kind of floral and sweet-smelling. But before Kim and Chu began exploring all the kind of main tourist attractions, they wanted to go check out the fishing pier, which was not really a touristy attraction. It was just a regular fishing pier. But, Kim and Chu had been on this hour-long train ride and they wanted to stretch their legs, and the sun was starting to go down, and so they figured they could walk out on the pier, have a beautiful view of the water, then watch the sunset, and then after that, they could go kind of explore the main areas. And so Kim and Chu, still holding hands, began walking on the silver sandy beach in the direction of this fishing pier off in the distance. And as they were walking, Chu pulled out her camera and was taking all these pictures. But then at some point, Kim, who again is holding Chu's hand, he just abruptly stops and kind of squints his eyes and looks off in the distance towards the fishing pier. And Chu, she puts her camera down and asks Kim, what's going on? But Chu, without even saying anything to her, just raises his hand and points. And then seconds later, Kim and Chu were running down the beach. The next day, Chu was supposed to call her mother and check in about how the trip was going so far, but she never did. And so her mother eventually tried calling Chu later in the day, but it went straight to voicemail. And then also when Chu's mother called Kim, Kim was also not answering his phone. And so by the end of this day, when Kim and Chu's parents had not heard from their child, they did not wait for any more information. This was so uncharacteristic of Kim and Chu, who were always good about checking in and letting their family know what they were doing, that the parents, they just immediately went to the police and filed missing person reports. The police would launch an investigation very quickly, but they didn't have much to go on. All they knew was 2 adults were not answering their phone, but that was it. And so they started by trying to locate Kim and Chu's phones, but neither phone was giving off a signal, so they couldn't find them. And so next, the police went to Yelpo Beach and began talking to people who were there on the day that Kim and Chu were to ask them if they had noticed anything funny, if they had seen the couple, did you notice them fighting? Were they talking to anyone unusual? Anything. But nobody remembered anything out of the ordinary, and the few people who had seen Kim and Chu on the day they were at Yelpo Beach, they said they seemed like a very happy, normal couple that were not fighting at all and were just enjoying their time in Yelpo Beach. And so over the course of that weekend, the police tried everything they could to try to locate Kim and Chu and figure out what happened, but they really made no progress whatsoever, and Kim and Chu never checked in by the end of that weekend. But everything would change on that Monday, September 3rd. On that day, a fisherman spotted a body floating in the water near Yelpo Beach, and it was Chu's body. And then 2 days after that, on September 5th, Kim's body washed up at a dock at a nearby fishing village. Both Kim and Chu were totally unrecognizable after being submerged in water for as long as they had been. Autopsies would show that Kim and Chu also had lots of bone fractures, but it wasn't clear if they were beaten by someone or something and that's what caused the fractures, or if they were just a product of being in the water for so long and smashing into rocks and boats and that kind of thing. But the police thought, this looks like there could be foul play involved, maybe they were murdered. And so the police went back and began scouring all the footage from all the cameras at Yelpo Beach to see if maybe they could find some clip that would show what happened to this couple. And eventually, one of the detectives who was looking through all this footage found something really interesting. He found a very short clip of the couple over at that fishing pier that they had been walking towards. However, they were not up on the fishing pier like you would expect. They were below the fishing pier on the sand. And they were kind of standing next to each other, holding each other close, and there was nobody else around them. It was like this totally weird thing. Now, as weird as this was, because it made no sense for them to be below the fishing pier, there didn't appear to be any hazards or other people or anything near them. It was like they just chose to be under there for some reason. But regardless, the police would actually use this video clip to close the case. The police would say that, based on this clip, it appears that this was the final moment of the couple, underneath this pier, and then something happened. Either an accident, they might have fallen in the water or something and they drowned, or maybe, this couple elected to take their lives together. And while Kim and Chu's families vehemently disagreed with the police assessment, there was nothing they could do. The case was now closed. Nobody was trying to figure out what happened to Kim and Chu. That is, until 4 weeks later, on September 26, 2007, when 2 more bodies, 2 young women, washed up on shore right around the same area where Kim and Chu had. The 2 young women had a lot of similarities to Kim and Chu. They were in their early 20s, they were tourists at Yelpo Beach, and their autopsies discovered that they had several bone fractures. And so this was enough for the police to launch a much bigger investigation into what was going on at Yelpo Beach, which included reopening the Kim and Chu case. And so a detective was assigned to go back through all the evidence in the Kim and Chu case and kind of re-examine it. And so this detective did look through all these pictures, and he would find one picture that broke the case wide open. Back on the night that Kim and Chu were at Yelpo Beach and they began walking towards the fishing pier, Kim had abruptly stopped and raised his finger and pointed at something, and then seconds later, he and Chu were running in that direction. Well, what Kim had spotted was a fisherman who was standing below the fishing pier, and he was very obviously making his way over to his fishing boat to go back out on the water. And Kim just felt like it would be really cool to go ask that fisherman if they could join him and go out on the water with him on his fishing boat to get a view of Yelpo Beach that way. And Chu, when she heard this idea, thought it was a great idea, and the two of them ran to the pier to try to catch this fisherman before he took off. And so that was why there was footage of the couple standing underneath the fishing pier. They were actually talking to this fisherman who could not be seen in frame. The fisherman was a 70-year-old man named Woo Jun Gwen, and he made his living selling octopus. And at first, when Kim and Chu approached Woo and asked to go with him on his boat, he said, "No, I don't want you to come with me." But Kim and Chu seemed really desperate to go out with him, and finally he relented and said, "Okay, you can tag along." Woo was very thin and short, but he had been working on fishing boats since he was a child, and so despite his appearance of being this kind of small, frail guy, he was actually really physically strong. And despite Woo's kind of harmless-seeming exterior, inside, Woo was a very, very disturbed person. The reason Woo did not want to bring Kim and Chu with him out on this boat is he knew he would have an urge that he would not be able to control. But when they kept begging him over and over again to go with him, he finally just accepted that this was going to happen. He allowed them on his boat, he brought them out onto the water, and sure enough, he would act on those urges. Once Woo's boat was out on the water far away from the beach, he immediately pushed Kim overboard, and so Kim falls into the water, and then Woo grabbed this long metal grappling hook and began beating Kim in the water on his face, his arms, his hands, as Kim desperately tried to climb back in the boat. And eventually, Woo literally beat Kim to death. And at the same time, Chu is on this boat watching this happening. And so after her boyfriend has been beaten to death, Woo turns on Chu and does the same thing to her. He chucks her overboard and beats her until she dies from this grappling hook. And then afterward, Woo just got back behind the wheel, putted back to shore, and sold his octopus like nothing had happened. And Woo very likely would have gotten away with these first two murders, except 4 weeks later, it just so happened that two more tourists, those two young women, just happened to ask Woo the same question. "Can we go out with you on your boat?" And he would kill them the same way he killed Kim and Chu. Except one of those two young women, while they were out on the water in his boat before they were attacked, she sensed something was wrong, and she sent a text message saying she was in trouble on a boat. And when the police found these two women's bodies and found that text message, they immediately searched the registry that listed all the boats that had been out on the water near Yelpo Beach that day. And because it was a holiday, there was nobody out on the water except for one boat. And that boat was Woo's boat. And this is where that photo the detective found on Chu's camera roll, when finally somebody looked through the photos, that's where that photo comes into play. The last picture that Chu took is of Woo. Woo is right in front of her. He's piloting the boat out into the open ocean, and Chu just took a picture of him, not knowing what was actually happening. That this guy was driving her out to her death. Ultimately, Woo would be convicted of the murders, even though he didn't really offer up any clear explanation as to why he killed these people. He just kind of acted on these urges, so to speak, and he would be sentenced to death. and he would become the oldest death row inmate in South Korea.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time. On a December afternoon in 2013, 80-year-old Peggy Nadell gazed out of her second-story bedroom window, watching the snow fall onto the ground below. Peggy's large gray wooden house sat tucked away in Valley Cottage, New York, a small upscale enclave located in Clarkstown, less than an hour northwest of New York City. Peggy had lived in this house for 50 years. She loved her small town, and she thought there was something really special about it in the winter. The snow made everything quiet, beautiful, and almost otherworldly. In her bedroom, Peggy glanced down at her watch. She felt like she could stand there for hours just staring at the snowfall, but she had someplace to be, and Peggy hated being late. So she walked out of her room and down a hallway across an old hardwood floor to the stairs. Peggy held onto the banister and slowly made her way to the first floor. At 80 years old, Peggy was still in great shape. She exercised almost every day at the nearby Jewish community center, and even when there was snow on the ground and it was freezing outside, she still enjoyed walking around town or in the public park that was close to her house. But Peggy admitted that the stairs in her house had begun to get a bit tricky for her, and her daughter, Suzanne, had become paranoid that Peggy was going to take a bad fall and hurt herself on the stairs. So Peggy, not wanting to worry her family, now made it a point to take her time when she was going up and down the stairs and to always hold on to the banister. Peggy finally reached the first floor, and she walked across the living room towards the front of the house. Peggy's house was almost like a museum, and also a time capsule. There were paintings hung on the walls, and small sculptures and other pieces of art that could be found on tables and shelves in the living room, but there was also 50 years worth of family keepsakes, photos of her grown children at almost every age, and some recent drawings her grandkids had made for her. Peggy pulled a long coat off a coat rack by the front door, and she put it on over her black sweater. Peggy had short brown hair that she styled every day, and she wore red lipstick. Peggy had been obsessed with fashion from a young age, and that obsession had never really gone away. So she always tried to look and dress her best whenever she left the house. Peggy grabbed a leather bag that contained books, notebooks, and pens. Then she set the house alarm by pushing on a keypad by the door, and then she walked outside across the porch to her car parked in the driveway. Peggy got in, started the car, turned on the radio, and began heading towards New York City. After driving into the city and parking her car, Peggy made her way through a big throng of people walking down Fifth Ave in Manhattan. She looked at the holiday decorations and Christmas lights hanging around the street, and she had a huge smile on her face. As much as Peggy loved living in her sleepy little town, there was nothing quite like being in the big city. Over the course of her life, Peggy had traveled all over the world. She'd seen Roman ruins, the pyramids in Egypt, and she'd laid on beautiful beaches all around the globe. But New York City had always been a very special place for her. Peggy walked for a few minutes and then stepped into a white stone building that housed one of the City University of New York's campuses in the area. Inside, Peggy made her way to a small classroom where she was sitting in on a PhD-level art history class. Peggy said hello to some of the other students who had already arrived. Many of them were at least 50 years younger than she was. Peggy made it to her seat, she pulled off her coat and put it on the back of her chair, then she sat down and grabbed her notebook out of her bag. A young woman sitting nearby smiled, and Peggy smiled back. Peggy knew she must be a bit of a mystery to most of her fellow students. They must have wondered why this well-dressed old lady was in class with them. But anybody who knew Peggy even reasonably well knew that she had always prized learning and education above almost anything else. Back in the mid-1950s, Peggy had fallen in love with a man named Robert Nadell, and she had gotten married to him. And not long after they got married, Peggy gave birth to their daughter, Suzanne. Then, a couple of years later, Peggy had their son, Jim. And Peggy loved being a mother, but she didn't want to just stay at home. So she had decided to go back to school to get her MBA, a graduate business degree. Her husband, Robert, had been totally thrilled about her decision. He thought Peggy was one of the smartest people he'd ever met, and he knew how important education was to her. But at the time, most other people around Peggy had thought she was crazy for wanting to go back to school for anything, especially a master's degree in business, because at this time in the 1960s, women represented less than 1% of students at the top MBA programs in the United States. But Peggy believed it was her duty to continue learning as much as she could, and she had refused to accept that being a woman had anything to do with her ability to succeed in business school or the corporate world. And so after getting her MBA, Peggy had proven everybody who doubted her wrong. She had gone on to work for Xerox, a huge corporation that was a pioneer in photocopiers and other technology products, and after years of working at that company, Peggy had become one of Xerox's first female executives. Peggy had a long and very successful career, and when she had finally stepped away from her work, she enjoyed retirement right alongside her husband Robert. They had loved to travel, and they had spent a lot of their time helping their community by volunteering for local groups and charities. And as much as Peggy had loved her high-powered executive job, she actually enjoyed the volunteer work that she and Robert were able to do even more. But then, in 2003, Robert had died unexpectedly, and suddenly Peggy had found herself all alone in her big old house. Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, lived about 20 minutes away, and so the mother and daughter spent a lot of time together. But Peggy knew Suzanne had a life and a job that kept her busy, and Peggy didn't want to give up on all the things that made her happy just because she was on her own now. She wanted to keep learning about new things and experiencing new things. So Peggy had begun to study art history, a subject she'd always been interested in. And eventually, she decided she wanted to learn as much as she possibly could about art history. So at 80 years old, Peggy began sitting in on these PhD-level art history classes. Not to get another degree, but just because she really loved it and wanted to learn more. Peggy listened closely and took extensive notes during the professor's lecture. And as Peggy wrote in her notebook, she almost felt like a kid again. She knew how absurd that would sound to the others in the class. After all, she was a mother and a grandmother, and she had lived a full life by this point. But Peggy felt like learning new things was really the best way to stay active and engaged in the world around her. Later that night, Peggy was in her bedroom, still thinking about what she learned that day in class, as she changed out of her clothes into her nightgown. Then, once she was changed, she sat down on her bed, and she grabbed the home phone off the bedside table. Now, there were two people Peggy usually talked to multiple times a day: her daughter, Suzanne, and her daughter-in-law, Diana. Peggy knew both women liked to check on her a lot to make sure she was okay, Suzanne was paranoid about Peggy falling down the stairs, and Diana, who was married to Peggy's son and lived in Florida, worried about Peggy going out and driving when it was cold and snowing. Peggy regularly reminded her daughter and daughter-in-law that she was more than capable of taking care of herself, but she did love talking to them both and staying in touch. So Peggy called her daughter, Suzanne, and told her all about the day's art history class. Then, after she was done speaking to Suzanne, Peggy called Diana in Florida. Now, Peggy's son was not much for phone calls, so his wife, Diana, was really Peggy's only real connection to her grandkids who lived so far away. Peggy told Diana that she really missed everybody and that she was hoping she could pay for Diana and her son's 2 kids to come visit her in New York that summer. When Diana heard that, she got really excited and said the kids would love that. Eventually, the 2 women wrapped up the call and said goodnight, and then Peggy hung up the phone and walked over to the bedroom window. It was still snowing outside, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlights. Peggy was still struck by how beautiful the winter scene always looked, but now that she knew her grandkids were very likely coming to visit her, she could not wait for summer to arrive. Over a month later, on January 24, 2014, Peggy was in her room getting ready for bed again. Peggy had kept busy over the recent holiday season. She'd spent the first night of Hanukkah with her daughter Suzanne, and she had also talked to her daughter-in-law Diana and her grandkids in Florida almost every day. She'd gone to various holiday parties in town with close friends, and she continued to exercise at the Jewish Community Center. But despite how fun the holiday season had been, it still totally wore Peggy out, and she was still feeling tired weeks later. So she was hoping to sleep in late the following morning and get caught up on some much-needed rest. It hadn't snowed in weeks, but temperatures had dropped to a freezing 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was cold and drafty inside of Peggy's old house. So she climbed into bed and pulled a whole pile of warm blankets over her. Then she turned off the lamp on her bedside table and eventually drifted off to sleep. But just a few hours later, at 1:17 a.m., so this is now on January 25th, Peggy woke up startled. Her home phone was ringing on the bedside table right next to her, and the sound had pulled her out of her dream. She took a breath and got her bearings, and then leaned over and flipped the switch on the lamp. Peggy looked at the clock next to the phone and saw how late it was, and she started to panic because she was worried that a phone call at this hour could only mean something bad had happened. Peggy sat up in bed and cautiously answered the phone, and then after talking to the caller for about a minute, Peggy relaxed. Now, Peggy was still a bit shocked from getting a call in the middle of the night that woke her up, but there was no emergency or any bad news. Peggy just had a couple of unexpected late-night visitors standing outside of her house. So Peggy got out of her bed, she walked to her closet and put on her robe and slippers. Then she headed downstairs and walked to the front door. She opened the door and smiled at the 2 people standing outside. But before she could let her visitors in, a loud, very high-pitched beeping sound began echoing through Peggy's house. Peggy had forgotten to turn off the house alarm before she opened the door. Peggy quickly punched in the code on the keypad right near the door, and it turned the alarm off, but the phone in the kitchen started ringing, so Peggy rushed to go grab it. The alarm company was calling to see if everything was okay, and Peggy would give them a password to let them know it really was her, and then she told them everything was fine. Then she hung up the phone and called out to her visitors to come inside. And they did. They joined Peggy in the kitchen, and she poured each of them a glass of water. Then the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table and talked for a few minutes, and then Peggy stood up and excused herself. Peggy walked through the living room and went up the stairs to the second-floor bathroom, which was a lot warmer than the one on the first floor. But when Peggy was done and about to leave the bathroom, she heard shouting outside and footsteps on the stairs. And so Peggy stepped out of the bathroom, and she was surprised to see her 2 visitors were standing right there outside. They were quiet and kind of awkward, and Peggy thought maybe the 2 of them were in the middle of some kind of argument that she had now just kind of butted herself into. But Peggy smiled at them and said, "Let's go down to the kitchen and keep on talking." Then Peggy walked past them, put her hand on the banister, and began walking down the steps. And the 2 visitors followed her. But before reaching the bottom of the stairs, Peggy heard one of her visitors begin to scream right behind her. Several hours later, at 9 a.m. on January 25th, so almost 8 hours after the visitors had arrived at Peggy's house, Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, stepped out of her car in front of Peggy's house. Suzanne was 55 years old with frizzy dyed blonde hair. She wore jeans, tennis shoes, a t-shirt, and a big winter coat. Suzanne had not inherited her mother's love of fashion. Instead, Suzanne preferred comfort over style. Suzanne walked quickly to the front door. It was bitterly cold out, but Suzanne barely noticed. She had woken up that morning and called her mother like she did almost every day, but Peggy hadn't answered. There was a chance Peggy could have just slept in or gone out to exercise, but Suzanne had tried calling back a little bit later, and Peggy still didn't answer. So Suzanne had called her sister-in-law, Diana, because she knew Diana usually called Peggy several times a day too, and Diana said she had called Peggy too at around 7:30 that morning, but Peggy didn't pick up, and so Diana said she left a message but still had not heard back yet. After talking to Diana, Suzanne was worried enough that she decided to just drive over to her mother's house to make sure everything was okay. Once Suzanne reached her mother's porch, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the key she had to her mother's house. She used it to open up the door, and then once she was inside, she called out for her mother, but there was no answer. So Suzanne began walking around the first floor of the house, and when Suzanne walked into the living room, she let out a blood-curdling scream. Suzanne saw Peggy's crumpled body on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Suzanne instinctively ran to her mother, and when she got a good look at her, she saw there was a knife sticking out of Peggy's chest. And so Suzanne dropped down and just yanked the knife out and threw it on the floor, and then she leaned in and touched her mother's face, and she could feel that Peggy's skin had gone totally ice cold. Totally distraught, Suzanne took out her cell phone and dialed 911. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Suzanne began yelling that she needed help and that her mother must have fallen down the stairs while holding a knife and she accidentally stabbed herself. Not long after the 911 call, Detectives Stephen Cole Hatchard and Earl Lawrence of the Clarkstown Police Department pulled up in a sedan outside of Peggy's house and stepped out of the car. The snow had started again, and they could feel the cold biting into their hands and faces. Local police had already run crime scene tape all across the front of Peggy's house, and some of Peggy's neighbors had already begun to gather nearby. Hatchard and Lawrence also saw Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, pacing back and forth in the driveway, a few feet in front of a uniformed police officer. Suzanne was mumbling to herself, and she looked totally dazed. The detectives approached Suzanne and introduced themselves, and Suzanne immediately repeated what she had said to the 911 operator. Her mother must have fallen down the stairs while she was holding a knife and accidentally stabbed herself. Suzanne said she had been worried about her mother on those stairs for a long time. But before the detectives could even really process what Suzanne was talking about, she would say something that sent up multiple red flags. Suzanne told Hatchard and Lawrence that police would likely find her fingerprints on the knife because she had pulled the knife out of her mother's chest before trying to administer CPR on her mother. And Suzanne said her fingerprints were all over the house because she went to visit her mom there all the time. But Suzanne didn't stop there. She just kept on talking. And she would tell the detectives that her mom was really rich, but she said this was not how she wanted to inherit her cut of her mom's estate. Detective Hatchard told Suzanne to wait with the officer outside and that they would talk to her once they had searched the house. Then Hatchard and Lawrence walked towards the front door while Suzanne began pacing in the driveway again. The detectives couldn't believe what they had just learned. They hadn't even stepped inside the house yet, but already Peggy's daughter had admitted to tampering with evidence by pulling the knife out of her mother's chest. Suzanne had also tried to cover for the fact that her fingerprints would be found on a potential weapon and throughout the house. And she had given a clear motive for possibly having killed her mother by talking about Peggy's money. That said, Hatchard and Lawrence knew that people under stress could act in strange ways, especially when dealing with the death of a loved one. But neither of them had ever encountered anything like what had just happened with Suzanne. It sort of seemed like she had worked up a big cover story and then blurted all of it out as soon as cops showed up. Inside the house, detectives Hatchard and Lawrence found a small group of forensics officers searching for fingerprints, blood samples, and other physical evidence. When the local police had first arrived on the scene, they really weren't sure what they were dealing with, or if Suzanne's story about her mom falling with the knife was true, so a forensics team and the detectives had been called in. But when Hatchard and Lawrence reached the bottom of Peggy's stairs, They didn't need forensics officers to tell them that Suzanne's version of what happened was totally off. On the ground in front of the detectives was Peggy Nadell. She was dead and lying face up on the floor. The detectives crouched down and right away saw multiple knife wounds in Peggy's chest, and they saw the knife that Suzanne said she had removed lying on the floor nearby. And when detectives looked more closely at Peggy's body, they began to notice wounds on the side of her head as though she had been struck with a blunt object several times. And right near Peggy's face was this small sculpture, which was the bust of someone's head, and then near Peggy's hand was a gold medal ball, another piece of art. And so maybe those two things were the blunt object that had been smashed into Peggy. Also, the detectives saw bruising around Peggy's neck and throat, which most likely indicated that Peggy had been strangled at some point. In short, there was no way Peggy had just tumbled down the stairs while holding a knife, and that was how she accidentally killed herself. Clearly, this was a murder. Hatchard and Lawrence were appalled by what they saw. Any violent crime was bad enough, but neither of them could understand what type of person would attack a defenseless 80-year-old woman. The detectives assumed Peggy must have been struck in the head with either the small sculpture or that golden ball that were laying close by her body, but forensics officers said no fingerprints or physical evidence had been found on either of those objects. It was like they had both been wiped clean. So the detectives stepped away from Peggy's body and walked upstairs and went to search Peggy's bedroom. In the bedroom, they saw a few dresser drawers were laid out on the floor, and there was an open jewelry box on top of the dresser. Someone had clearly rifled through the jewelry box, but it was still filled with several expensive pieces. Hatchard and Lawrence looked around the rest of the room, and when they were done with their cursory check, they both had the same thought. This was not a robbery. If anything, this was a weak attempt by Peggy's killer to make it look like a robbery. By 1 p.m., so about 4 hours after Suzanne made that 911 call, Hatchard and Lawrence had finished their initial search of the crime scene and had briefed their boss on what they had found. They weren't sure exactly what had happened in the house, but they knew there was only one place to start their investigation, and that was with Peggy's daughter, Suzanne.